Welcome, everyone. I'm Russ Feingold, the president of the American Constitution Society. We're the country's foremost progressive legal network with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Founding Failures, Transformational Change, and the Movements for Racial Equity. ACS is celebrating its 20th year of shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow us on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. And there you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. We are actually focusing our work in this important anniversary year on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country, and reckoning with our past to create a more just future. As we've explored in our Founding Failures series to date, racial inequality in America is rooted in the legal infrastructure of this country, from the drafting of our first laws to the very design of our government. Our laws and legal systems have been unfortunately used to sustain and legitimize racial oppression, and we at ACS believe it will take real transformative legal change to help root out white supremacy and build toward racial equality. As we just recently announced at our annual convention this year, ACS supports the establishment of a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission in the United States. We are also encouraging our members to engage with local initiatives that aim to reckon with state and local law and histories and explore redress and restitution. So our panel today will discuss several of these ongoing movements. All right, so now I'd like to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Zanelle October, the ACS Executive Vice President, who will lead today's discussion with our distinguished speakers. Zanelle?
Thank you, Russ. As you said, in June, we set out ACS's plan to engage on the long-term project of truth, racial healing, and transformation, which included a commitment to hosting conversations like this one. This summer, as passions erupt across the country over who decides what version of our history is taught in schools and who is able to participate freely in our democracy, it remains painfully clear that if we are to move forward toward racial equity, truth-telling is required. This work involves all of us because we are all harmed by unfair laws and institutions. The progressive legal community has an opportunity to help drive this work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panel of experts today. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. First, please note that today's panel is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website, acslaw.org. Second, if you'd like to ask a question at any time during the call, please type it into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We will be taking questions after our initial discussion, and we'll try to address as many as possible. I also want to note that the Racial Healing and Transformation, featuring my discussion with Dr. Gail Christopher, who helped develop the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework, together with Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law. If you're interested in further analysis of these important issues after today's program, I encourage you to check out Broken Law on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, 1.25 hours of California CLE credit is available for this program. Please email us with transformation in the subject line at info@acslaw.org to receive your certificate. If you are seeking CLE credit in a jurisdiction other than California, please consult the rules of that state CLE board to see if it provides for reciprocity with California. CLE materials can be found in a follow-up email. now. Today, we're so fortunate to have three experts in this space. First, we are joined by Dreisen Heath, United States program, focusing on racial justice issues. Dreisen is an expert on reparations and reparatory justice and has authored reports and publications highlighting victims' rights to seek full and effective reparations that are proportional to the gravity of the human rights violations, including acts of racial discrimination, as dictated by international human rights law. She has testified as an expert witness and has been published regularly on ongoing structural racism, racial inequality, and her work supporting the movement for reparations. Next, we have Dr. Yuvraj Joshi, an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia Allard School of Law, where he teaches constitutional and transnational law and rights on issues of equality. He is also a fellow of the Harvard Carr Center for Human Rights and a faculty affiliate at the UCLA Promise Institute for Human Rights. His career experience, including for Human Rights Watch and Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, and time in private practice at Linklaters LLP. Dr. Joshi's research is in the areas of constitutional and comparative law, racial equality law, gender, and sexuality law, and critical perspectives on human rights. Finally, we have Zenita Wickham Hurley, Chief Counsel for Civil Rights for Maryland's Office of the Attorney General. Zenita spearheaded the creation of the office's first civil rights unit, staffed full-time by legal counsel, and advises the Office on legal matters impacting civil rights issues and programs. Zenita is also a part of the staff of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established by state law to research cases of racially motivated lynching and to hold public meetings and regional hearings. Lynching of an African American by a white mob has been documented. Prior to her time in the Office of the Attorney General, Zenita served as Special Secretary in the Maryland Governor's Office of Minority Affairs and Director of Minority Business Enterprise at the Maryland Department of Transportation. Thank you to all our panelists for joining today's discussion. Dreisen, I'd like to start with you. Right now, there are growing movements for a National Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, and also for a National Commission to study reparations. Could you help set the table for us on what these commissions aim to do and how they interact with each other?
Great. Thank you so much, Sanel, and thank you to ACS for hosting this very timely conversation that we're having today. And I'm grateful to be on with these esteemed panelists as well. You know, we are truly at a once in a generation moment where crises are converging all at once, economic crises, social, political, on top of that, still battling a global pandemic. And that all the more reason presents an opportunity to advance forward on this goal of racial healing, this goal of transforming our society into something other than what it was actually founded on the oppression, displacement, and mass brutalization of Indigenous and descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. And so we're at a key moment. And why I say that, you know, folks talk about last year, 2020, after George Floyd's murder, fueling people into the streets, a grassroots movement we have not seen to that proportion in our country's history. Moving on to today, where we also still are having people deny that there is disproportionate brutality on Black and Brown people in this country, at the same time passing laws, as Russ spoke to in his opening, passing laws to further marginalize and bury these truths. So truth-telling is essential to us getting forward to a pathway where we're all equal and there is not just equality, but equity on all levels. And so we have HCON Res 100 in the Congress. That is a resolution introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee out of California, which urges the establishment of a United States Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And this is a part of a growing movement to properly acknowledge, memorialize, and be a catalyst for progress moving forward. It's also propped up as a complement to HR 40, the Commission to develop and study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans Act, which has been introduced for over 32 years since the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, which granted reparations to Japanese Americans who were wrongfully incarcerated and forced from their homes during World War II. So there was a glimmer of hope in 1989 that, hey, maybe this country is actually willing to reckon with some of its other worst crimes. In the Congress now, with that said, with the movement towards advancing truth and acknowledging truth, you also have the political elements that naturally impact where we are today and what is considered in moving forward. So HR 40, the federal reparations bill, which would establish a commission to study and develop material remedies. So we're not even talking about implementation yet. This is not a direct proposal, but it is a commission. And even the idea of a commission to examine reparations has been stalled for over 32 years. We just received a Judiciary Committee vote in April of this year on the bill, which is the first time it's ever been voted out of subcommittee. So in terms of moving forward and advancing actual racial equity, the federal government has dragged its feet as local and state governments have taken on reparations initiatives across the country, especially in these last 5 years. So, we know that the demands of seeking and obtaining full and effective remedy for gross human rights violation like slavery, which was national policy, redlining, which was national policy, urban renewal programs, which are national policy, serious human rights violations like police killings, and racial discrimination like housing discrimination, like land acquisition discrimination. These are not new issues, but it's a human rights battle. And these two bills, one HR 40, a bill that has authorized federal commission with federal dollars, and a resolution which urges the establishment of a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. They're certainly in the same vein of accomplishing similar things. But as one of the lead advocates on HR 40, there is a clear distinction of, HR 40 specifically dealing with the impacts of the legacy of slavery that are still continuing today and impacting people, and also developing actual remedies. So, what we're looking towards as advocates is not just the study that will sit on a shelf and be dusty for decades to come, but actual recommendations and solutions that can then be adopted and moved forward. So not just a study, but also remedies to respond to the dire needs of Black people in this country today.
Thank you for that, Dreisen. I think you helped set the stage for us, and I have a couple of quick follow-up questions, if you don't mind. Who would participate in these commissions? What would the role of the public be?
Sure. So it's a 15-member commission, appointed, some members appointed by the president, some members appointed by the speaker, some by the vice president. There's also about 5 or 6 members from organizations, advocacy organizations that have historically focused on these issues on issues that are familiar with the struggles and the actual documentation of impacts of the legacy of slavery, be it economic damage, psychological damage, social or political harms. And so that's what the commission, 15-member commission, is similar to the Japanese Americans Wartime Commission on Internment and Relocation. There will be an opportunity for public hearings. So what is important about these types of commissions is that the community is actually informing where this work is going. It is not reparations or reparatory justice if it excludes people who have been directly impacted in every phase of the program. So in terms of the commission being built and the commission's recommendations, that should all be informed, designed primarily by people that have been directly affected. And so with the Wartime Commission on Relocation and Internment, they went across to several major cities and held public hearings, just completely transformed the public's even, not knowledge and willingness to understand this horrible treatment that happened that was, buried even by some of the people that experienced it because it's a traumatic experience. And so people relived those experiences in public. There will be opportunities for community organizations and individuals who have been directly impacted, whether you've been, dispossessed from your land as a Black farmer, whether you faced housing discrimination, whether you're a direct descendant of someone who suffered from the chattel slavery system, whether you're a victim of police violence, whether you're a victim of predatory lending. These are all experiences that need to be captured within the HR 40 Reparations Commission.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Dr. Joshi, I'd like to go to you next. The United States certainly wouldn't be the first to turn to a national commission to attempt to reckon with history and racial divides. Could you help us place this in the context of what other countries have done?
Sure, and thank you to ACS for this wonderful event and for including me. As Dreisen has just helpfully set out for us, calls for truth, reconciliation, repair resonate across the United States, but they also resonate in countries across the world, often under the label of transitional justice. Transitional justice concerns how societies move from oppression, conflict, violence towards a more just and peaceful order. Most often, transitional justice is associated with a specific set of measures like truth and reconciliation commissions, criminal prosecutions, reparations programs, institutional reforms that are meant to address massive human rights abuses. However, this is not a closed list. Transitional justice can include a wide range of measures, promoting accountability for wrongdoings, providing redress for injustices, ensuring non-repetition of injustices, and facilitating reconciliation. So perhaps the most famous example of this is South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a court-like body established to facilitate that country's transition from apartheid to democracy. But this is, again, not limited to just transitional regimes. Transitional justice measures have been used even within so-called established democracies, and even without a regime change. For example, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are among the countries that have used transitional justice approaches to address the histories and legacies of Indigenous oppression. This transitional justice canon confirms that historic injustices and their legacies need to be addressed everywhere, even in places like the United States. And indeed, the rest of the world might have something to teach the United States about dealing with the past.
Excellent, thank you. I think it's really important for us to bring that international piece to the discussion. So we look forward to continuing that with you, Dr. Joshi. Sunita, let me turn to you for the moment. We mentioned earlier that Maryland established by state law the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission as part of a state level movement for truth telling. Could you tell us a bit about the commission's scope, how it's been going so far, and do you see Maryland's commission as a model for other states or localities?
Yes, thank you, Zanelle, and thank you so much to ACS for hosting this important conversation and inviting me to be here to talk about what we're doing here in Maryland. As you mentioned, the Maryland Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2019. It was introduced as House Bill 307 by Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, and was really based upon the research and scholarship of several civil rights agencies and historians, which had documented over 40 racial terror lynchings in Maryland between 1933 and 1954. And this scholarship included the work of Equal Justice Institute, Sherilyn Eiffel, who actually wrote an article calling for Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as a number of local historically Black colleges and universities, and some local civil rights museums, and really a number of local coalitions that had organized around researching and documenting racial terror lynchings that had occurred in their respective communities. And so it was really based upon all of that work and all that testimony that we were able to advance House Bill 307 and establish a Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And by state law, that commission is organized into three main areas in terms of advancing truth and reconciliation. The first is researching. The commission is charged with researching the more than 40 racial terror lynchings, determining whether there are additional lynchings that we can find documentation of, as well as investigating whether there was complicity or other involvement of state, local, and county government entities and the media. And so that's sort of the research aspect. As you mentioned, Zanelle, the commission is also charged with holding public hearings. And there'll be a number of public hearings held in the regions where we have documented that a racial terror lynching has occurred, for the purpose of really gathering information and feedback from community members in terms of how we can address, engage, and reconcile the impacted communities around this history and this legacy of lynching. And, interestingly, the only example of a potential remedy that was included in the statute is the erection of memorial markers. That's an activity that Maryland has been engaged in the past couple of years, most recently, just a few months ago, for a memorial for Howard Cooper in Baltimore County, a very young lynching victim. I believe he was 16 years old when he was lynched for the crime of assaulting a white female. And so there's a lot of work that has been going on in Maryland around this, and the commission has really been charged with advancing this. I expect, to the extent that there are questions about the commission makeup, it is 18 members, sort of similar to what Dreisen was saying about a, federal U.S. commission. 14 of those members are identified in statute and really represent the different agencies that had done the scholarship work and the background work on this. So the, civil rights agencies, public historical agencies, HBCUs, as well as 4 public members that are appointed by the governor. How we come into play the Office of the Attorney General, we are charged in the statute with staffing the commission, and we were actually given authority to issue subpoenas in support of the commission's work, both to compel testimony as well as to ensure the production of documents where necessary. We do believe that the Maryland Commission is one of, if not the first of its kind in the United States. And somewhat surprisingly, the bill faced no opposition in the legislature. It was a bipartisan effort, and also in part because the Office of the Attorney General and the other two agencies that help staff the commission agreed to support the commission with existing resources. And so there was no fiscal note associated with the bill. But also, I think importantly, following up on Dreisen's comments, there was a commitment or effort to specifically not mention reparations in the bill. And so while the commission is not prohibited from considering a recommendation for, looking into reparations as a strategy for advancing healing, that language was not in the bill intentionally so. And I think for that reason, it got broad support and sort of sailed through the legislature. And as a comparison, for the last two legislative sessions, there was a bill introduced to create a commission to study reparations, and that bill has not moved at all. So you can see the difference in the approaches. This one is very focused on lynching and recommendations that don't mention reparations. But after the public hearings, the commission is charged with issuing two reports, an interim report that was issued last September and is available on the commission's website, and then a final report that is due in 2023. The work of the commission was delayed because of the pandemic. So we, kicked off in 2019, and then of course, a few months later, the pandemic hit. And so the work was slow, primarily because a lot of the community members and the work that we think will really be necessary to provide healing, we think would benefit from some in-person interactions. There are a lot of elder community members that just couldn't really connect with the video conferencing or didn't feel like that was appropriate. And so for the past 2 years, what the commission has done is really focused on standing itself up, creating subcommittees, educating stakeholders on the purpose of the commission, and also looking for funding. And the commission has engaged in some of the dialogue that is going on nationally around challenging, acknowledging, and then combating systemic racism and connecting the dots between the history and legacy of lynching to more modern day marginalization of Black and Brown people. And so police brutality, racial profiling, et cetera. So they have issued several statements in that area, participated in a number of panels, discussions around those issues. In October of last year, the Office of the Attorney General, on behalf of the commission, applied for and was awarded $300,000 from a U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance grant from their Emmett Till Cold Case Investigations Program. I think it was the first one that they issued under this program. It really was a reach for us to go for this because this grant was really to fund cold case investigations. And of course, 1850s to the 1930s, we're not going to be criminally prosecuting any offenders, but we were really creative in how we, articulated what a criminal justice investigation and what criminal justice could look like for these types of cases. And, we're successful in getting those monies. So we have begun to pull down from that grant to hire a research historian, a genealogist, and to do some truth, racial hearing, and transformation training workshops for commission staff so that they have the skills necessary to host, these public hearings and engage with, members of the community that are still traumatized by these events. And so we do expect to start holding hearings later this fall. We are imagining that they will be a hybrid. Assuming again that, Delta variant and other things considered, will be able to begin hosting some sort of hybrid, limited in person, but also perhaps streamed so that, as many people as in the community members can participate as possible. But even though we're sort of 2 years in, because of the delays with the pandemic, we do feel like we're just sort of getting started.
Okay, well, thank you for that really helpful background, Zadita. A quick follow-up question on that. So I know you've mentioned that there have been delays because of the, but what's been done so far? How is that being shared with the public, and what's the feedback that you're receiving already? And then the second part to that question is, and maybe it's too soon, you could tell me that, Do you think this is a good model for other states, especially since you mentioned states?
We are, how are things going so far? Well, I think this is a perhaps much more, well, I guess I can't say it's much more controversial than I envisioned, because what is more controversial than confronting the legacy of slavery and lynching in this country? But there are so many sensitivities around how testimonies, history, records are handled, that, I do wish in many ways that there was a clear roadmap, that we could follow. But we're very conscious that, believing to be the first to sort of do this, that we are doing our best to take our time and to seek and obtain the input of stakeholders, because there is a lot of distrust in the community, and we are being charged with bringing everyone to the table who was impacted. And so that doesn't just include descendants of the victims and their families, but also the descendants of those community members who stood around, who participated, who celebrated these horrific and brutal events. And that is very challenging. And so not only do you have sort of a reluctance and a reasonable fear about, the potential community members that participated, but there's also potentially in fear and distrust of government agencies, and those because of the roles that they played in these lynchings historically, and in a number of communities, modern day distrust that continues based on, community and law enforcement relationships. So there's a lot to navigate. And as I mentioned, when I talked about the forming of the commission, we have a lot of local coalitions that have already sprung up and are very rightfully so protective of both the community members who still house testimonies that have been passed down over time, as well as records. And so, we have been spending some of this time really just establishing credibility. And so from that standpoint, I think that is a good model. And for folks to realize that this is not easy, but it is important and is necessary. And I hope that what are we in, late 2021, that by the time we have, finished hosting our public hearings and have developed our recommendations, that we truly will be, have created at least one roadmap for one successful way of doing this. But it really is so dependent on your community members, who the testimonies, the document, and their current experiences with government and law enforcement, sort of who's at the table. I hope that answers your question.
That does, and very, very helpful. At this point, I'm going to remind the audience that's with us today that we will take Q&A from the Q&A box. If you wouldn't mind putting your questions there, we'll start taking them in a few minutes, but I'll start off to get a conversation among the panelists going. The first question that I have, you all have set such a great stage for national, some state, international, what's happening. With many local initiatives well underway, how should a national commission be designed to interact with those efforts? Dreisen, do you want to maybe take that one first?
Sure, absolutely. When dealing specifically with crimes associated with the legacy of slavery, when dealing with racial disparities that cannot be disconnected from the institution of chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and ongoing discrimination, we have to recognize that this harm was done at all levels, and it was multifaceted. So you had the federal government operating at certain laws and obstructions. You also had at the state level reinforcing some of those federal codes, or possibly because the federal government gave certain protections to marginalized communities, they rolled back some of those protections in the state jurisdictions. And then you also have the same thing locally. So for instance, Evanston's reparations, reparative program, which they allocated, a good chunk of money, and they've started with their first phase of just looking at a discriminatory housing code that was enforced locally in Evanston, and how they will provide then housing grants to try to remedy some of that harm from the local zoning code. Now, obviously, that local zoning code also interacted and reinforced the impacts of redlining, making it virtually impossible for Black people to own mortgage loans and houses in the area. That also played against the highway construction in Chicago. That also played against the urban renewal programs, which were at the federal level. So I think it's a bit, obviously they should be informing each other's processes, but they also should be a bit discreet and kept separately, because what reparative justice focuses on, what restorative justice focuses on, is narrowing in on those specific harms, because you then have to identify who all was impacted. So, the Maryland Commission investigating lynching, that's very specific to lynching victims and lynching perpetrators. You don't want to go outside of that scope, because then you're, the people that are impacted, you're not doing them do justice and do service. If there are other elements mixed into this, if there's a pretty clear scope in this particular investigative portion. That goes the same for any community that wants to identify specific local harm. So, expungement of records due to war on drugs enforcement at the local level. Well, there is also impacts at the federal level, but the federal government needs to also deal with that, in addition to any, local laws that help aid that harm. So it's an interactive relationship, but I wanna emphasize that there has to be some narrowing of the lines, just because people are at the center of this process. And that's what repair is all about, is making sure those who need to be repaired are actually repaired.
Great, thank you. Dr. Joshi, same question for you, but a little bit of international context, if you could. How have other nations dealt with this in commissions? Could you help us out a bit on that front?
Sure. I think looking abroad can provide the United States with a menu of options, design features that, local, state, national commissions here might consider. But I think there are sort of three larger lessons that we can learn from looking abroad that I think are especially relevant for the US, particularly given the political climate. Leaders like Mitch McConnell argue that, it doesn't make sense to talk about truth, reconciliation, and repair in the United States because simply too much time has passed. And there have been too many intervening events since slavery and Jim Crow for us to do anything about it. So the first lesson we learn from looking abroad is that it isn't too late for America's racial reckoning. Countries across the world have sometimes taken centuries to grapple with their pasts. And just to give you a few examples, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission reached back to residential schools since the 1860s. Burundi's commission extended to cover crimes since 1885. Mauritius's commission went back to the start of Dutch colonization in 1638. Brazil, back to Atlantic slave trade in the 1500s. And Philippines, back to 1521 colonization. And if these countries can look back in centuries of their past, so can the United States, and we can look abroad to sort of debunk and refute these arguments that it's too late. And the temporal horizon needs to be quite short. A second lesson that the US can learn from abroad is precisely what Dreisen was mentioning. An integrated transitional justice strategy is needed, one that pursues reparations alongside criminal legal reform, voting rights, affirmative action, judicial reform, and other structural changes. American public discourse tends to see each of these measures as panacea, right? They will solve racism. when they are actually just one measure designed to deal with a portion of the injustice that is faced today. So reparations may compensate for injustice and promote reconciliation in ways that other policies may not. In other words, there is transitional justice work that only reparations can do, or that reparations can do best, which is why reparations are needed. However, reparations alone may not be enough to eliminate the racial wealth gap or the structural barriers that created it. Nor will reparations solve enduring features of Black oppression, like voter suppression and police brutality. And because there is work that reparations cannot do, reparations need to be pursued alongside other measures. Once we understand these different pieces of the same transitional justice puzzle, we can begin to think about the relationships between them. None of them alone can overcome white supremacy, but all of them in tandem can be a path to progress. And then finally, as this is ACS, I should mention that looking abroad can also help us better understand American law and legal institutions. As I show in my academic work, we have arrived at this moment in part because the Supreme Court has been America's makeshift Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one that has failed at promoting both truth and reconciliation. There's a widely celebrated 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education. It didn't even acknowledge the truth about Jim Crow. In May 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote a memorandum where he told his colleagues that the Brown opinion should be, quote, above all, non-accusatory. As a result, Brown doesn't mention white people's humiliating and harmful treatment of Black children or segregationist white supremacist aims. And now we have a Roberts Court that has struck down school integration, that has struck down voting rights measures, and might do the same to affirmative action soon, on the premise that they are unnecessary, inappropriate, and even antithetical to ensuring a racially just society. And if the Supreme Court is a major barrier to America's racial reckoning, then we need to really seriously rethink its role in American democracy. And these are a few of the connections that looking abroad in a transitional justice lens can help us make.
Thank you for that, Dr. Joshi. So you've brought up the political climate, which I would love for us to talk about that. Skepticism out there that the US needs this type of coordinated and national, difficult to imagine a commission having universal public support, at least initially. How could we start building that kind of support for a commission and then public trust in a commission? To any of our panelists.
I mean, I feel like the truth is there is wide support for these efforts, including at the congressional level. But there's a lack of will to advance this forward because of whatever other political toss-ups and calculations that are actually not rooted in any evidence whatsoever. So I'll give you an example. Again, HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act, been on the books for 32 years, first introduced in 1989, now by late Representative John Conyers, now in the hands of Representative Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. Why has it taken, now the bill has gone into so many different iterations, which is now, originally it was just a look at studying the transatlantic slave trade. It's evolved into studying not only the institution of chattel slavery, but also the legacies thereafter and the ongoing discrimination, and then recommending actual proposals. This is getting its first subcommittee vote out of Judiciary Committee in April of 2021, in its 32nd year on the books. So you can just make what you will of that time frame. In terms of Japanese Americans, the Wartime Commission on Relocation and Internment was stood up in 1980. And the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 passed, signed into law by then Ronald Reagan, was then adopted in 1988, which provided reparations, not only financial compensation, but also education benefits and pardons for wartime, resistance to being forcibly removed from their homes. So we're in a time where HR 40 has 193 co-sponsors. That is enough for House leadership and others to take that bill, whip it in a positive direction, and pass the bill out of the House. We know that the Senate is an obstacle for everything. However, we also know that the president and the White House have executive authority, which has been used in the past. President Jimmy Carter set up the United States Holocaust Commission when there was resistance at the congressional level when he was in office. So there's also an opportunity for an executive order to just establish this reparations commission and to start its work. I will end on this note. You saw the Juneteenth federal holiday established, which was really, from an insider's perspective, was a bum-rushed bill that came out of nowhere. And that is a direct response to the movement of reparations gaining so much steam. Let's give you your holiday, your federal holiday. Now, let me say, we have a 415 to 14 vote in the House, passing almost unanimously in the Senate. That should be the same vote that, that the reparations bill receives. You are acknowledging the significance of Juneteenth. So now let's do the next step and actually address, and everyone loves to use the word reckon, and that has an actual meaning. There's action attached to a reckoning. It's not just a surfacing of information. It's also dealing with that information and repairing any harm that came out of that truth telling. So we're at a unique political moment where, at first it was taboo and controversial, and it still is a lie, right? To even mention reparations. We have Congress people who have told us, behind closed doors, I want to support this, but my district is not gonna, care for this. But then when you look at the scope of what repair is actually doing, yes, it's targeted in this case to descendants of enslaved Africans in the US. However, we're also dealing with the economic impacts of racial discrimination. We're dealing with the economic and psychological damage that this has done to the entire country. You have Citibank issuing reports talking about trillions of dollars lost to the US GDP because of racial discrimination in jobs, housing, and business entrepreneurship. That impacts everyone. Harvard producing a COVID-19 study that COVID-19, if reparations for slavery were instituted, COVID transmissions and deaths would have been curbed in the state of Louisiana. That's not just Black people dying, that's the entire community, being adversely affected because of the racial wealth gap. So we have to see these things holistically as something for this country to advance this country.
Well said, Dreisen, thank you. I want to bring Zanita in a bit to talk about this from the Maryland perspective, as we talk about local, state versus federal, and again, maybe asking the question in a different way to Zanita, for those skeptics that say maybe we don't need this kind of national undertaking. What do you think a commission could achieve that would be difficult to achieve if we don't have it? So why a commission specifically?
Why a federal commission or a commission at all?
For you, I guess a commission at all.
Okay. It's interesting listening to Dreisen speak and thinking to the challenges that we've had in the state of Maryland in passing a commission focused on reparations. Maryland is, a very diverse state. We have a significant majority Democratic legislature, both in the House and in the Senate. And still, a bill focused on creating a commission to evaluate and establish recommendations. Again, not to take action, but just to consider, take testimony, look at historical documentation and records, and then make recommendations, has been unable to get any traction. And, I think about the power of leadership and just bringing people together. Commissions that are backed by state law are great, particularly because they show the buy-in of leadership, the buy-in of legislature who passed the bill and represent, all the communities within the state, the buy-in of the governor who signed the bill into law, and so it galvanizes the participants. But when you have, a certain portion of the population that still rejects the truth of the origins of the country, of the experiences of Black and Brown people in this country, sometimes we have to act in the absence of that. And so while I think, it is important to continue to fight for the passage of the resolutions and HR 40, I think that there are actions that can be taken by the Biden administration, by other leaders to begin to do this work and to begin to, maybe more collaboratively than has been done to date, document and make the case. And I think this movement that we are in hopefully will result in a U.S. commission, and perhaps for the state of Maryland, we will see the success of a very targeted commission focused on lynchings, and we are extra focused in terms of a time period. We're looking primarily at those that have been, the time period where we've already documented these racial terror lynchings between 1854 and 1933. It's very narrow and very specific. And I think because of that, we were able to get bipartisan support and pass it. It's research. It's not criminal investigations such that, people were thinking, oh, are descendants or, people going to suffer criminal prosecution. Are they going to be accused of wrongdoing in a way that makes certain people uncomfortable, as Dr. Yoshi was saying? A lot of that was sort of taken out of the dialogue to make people more comfortable with the strategy. And perhaps, but certainly it's not considered to be off the table in terms of implementation of this commission. And so I hope that once we actually go about this process and we actually see how being honest about a community's history and experiences and bringing all impacted parties to the table, if we actually see what racial healing, what honest conversations, the impact that could have on communities, maybe that could inspire and really lay the groundwork for expanding into other areas like reparations, like other, redlining, which is another topic and area in terms of, where people live and how people live, racial wealth gap, et cetera. And so maybe, we will be able to help lay the groundwork for not just expansion into different areas in the state of Maryland, but also for this U.S. Commission. I hope that it doesn't take this long, and I really hope that we're able to capitalize on this moment that we're in. But looking at history and how long it has taken us to get this far with simply bringing a group of people together to research and to make recommendations and findings on certain areas, I wouldn't be surprised if sadly we won't need more.
Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry, heard you, Zanita. So thank you for that. I guess I'll go to Dr. Joshi now to answer that same question, but from the federal commission. Why a commission? Specifically, what would we not achieve by, what would be difficult to achieve if we don't have one?
So I think this sort of goes back to the issue of one of the questions posed in the chat is about the attacks on CRT and the 1619 project. Anything that vaguely mirrors talking about the role of race in American history is presented as controversial. And I mentioned presented as controversial because, in fact, it isn't controversial. And it is the role of some well-funded organizations that are fueling these attacks. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or several of those at federal, state, and local levels, can help counter some of these narratives. They can be important for movement building when there are attacks at the federal level that local communities can mobilize around setting the record about what actually happened. And once again, I will bring the Supreme Court and the law into this picture, because not a decision goes by these days on racial equality where John Roberts doesn't remind us that the country has changed. I believe the quote in Shelby County versus Holder was, 50 years later, things have changed dramatically. And a truth commission, such as a national commission, can help us set the record for a much larger historical trajectory, that this hasn't been the matter of a journey from civil rights to the present moment. It's been a matter of 1619 to the present moment, and even earlier in terms of colonization and other forms of slavery. And that is the historical trajectory we need to be talking about.
Great, thank you. And a question for all of you. We here at ACS are focusing on our laws and legal systems primarily. A national commission, of course, would be an opportunity to tell the truth and reckon with our history broadly, not just our laws and legal systems. But that said, could you tell us a bit, especially for our audience, why it's important that our laws be one of the key areas of focus for a commission?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And this also kind of tackles some misconceptions about reparations as defined in international human rights law, which is not just financial compensation, although that should absolutely be assessed when there's economically accessible or moral damage. But that also includes measures of satisfaction, memorials, truth-telling measures, rehabilitative measures, trauma-informed care, psychological measures, in addition to restitution measures, things that return of property, return of artifacts, return of land, restoring a community back to where they were prior to the violation, and lastly, guarantees of non-repetition, which really tackle legal reforms and institutional reforms. There are some institutions in this country, dare I say most, that were built up to marginalize certain groups of people. You are never going to see justice within a system of injustice. That system is not going to evolve into something different. Slave patrols in the 1800s are not going to evolve into anything different of our current law enforcement agencies if there is, still the incentive to profile and racialize based off of where someone lives and how much money they make and whether they are housed or not. So when we talk about guarantees of non-repetition, this is extremely important. As someone who supports the descendants and survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, we've dealt with legal impediments to them seeking justice and remedy that they deserve due to the statute of limitations. That at the federal level now, to have time bar claims on these horrendous crimes is something that victims all over the country, victims of racial violence and descendants of racial violence, have had to deal with. Not many people have sought successfully judicial remedy because of these time bars at the state level that are then enforced at the federal level. There was just a reintroduction of legislation by Representative Hank Johnson in the Tulsa manner to remove those barriers at the federal level. But even something as egregious as the Tulsa Race Massacre, an entire wipeout of a Black economy, fueling other areas of the country, there was no proper remedy, and still is not any legislative remedy or judicial remedy, although there's a pending civil suit currently. So even just taking just one small legal reform, which I think is actually a big legal reform of evaluating statute of limitations in the cases of incidents of racial violence, is going to be so key to alleviating some of the pain of this country, the trauma of this country, and actually getting us towards a pathway of racial healing.
Thank you. Does any of our other panelists have thoughts on that? If not, I'll continue. Okay, I want to switch slightly to talk about the nature of racial inequality in our country, which spans generations and affects different racial groups in different ways. Given all of that, how do we create transformational change that takes into account the needs of so many groups? Dr. Joshi, do you have any thoughts on that specifically, on how that's been handled in other places?
So this is where, again, the South African example, by the way, which has limitations, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really important, but was no utopia. There are arguments that it didn't deal, for instance, with socioeconomic harms as seriously as it should have, as opposed to civil and political harms. But apartheid was a system that didn't affect a community, it affected several communities. And courts have had to grapple with, how do we acknowledge the harms that were done to Black people versus those who were designated Indian or other racial groups. And those countries can provide examples for us that there are deep connections between different groups, intragroups, intergroups conflict. And yet it may be the case that some have suffered in different ways. I, as an Indian male, am not subject to anti-Black ideas about intelligence, about competence in the academy in the way some of my Black colleagues are. That's a reality of racism in Canada and the US. And we can acknowledge those truths and build connections between different movements and different communities when we are thinking about reconciliation.
Thank you. In our last few minutes left, I would like to give each panelist an opportunity to share any final thoughts, and also ask if you could include in those thoughts. We have an amazing ACS audience who's joined us today. How could they engage on these issues, both in their own communities and nationally? And plus, any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Dreisen, how about we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much. This has been a rich conversation. Just kind of reflecting back on some of the earlier thoughts, and I'm particularly thinking about Maryland right now, because while there's resistance to establishing the Reparations Commission, Maryland was one of the only few states that actually passed a resolution that supported the passage of HR 40 at the federal level. So it's always amazing, when you dig up the archives and see now, obviously, political changes, whatever the waivers are. change over time, but you know, that's always very interesting to me. And then you have Maryland doing this incredible investigative work, not only centered on the victims, but also on, you know, descendants of perpetrators as well, and maybe institutions that also aided this harm. And at the federal level, you also have the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act that has still not passed and been signed into law, which would create a federal civil action, you know, against lynching in this country, which we're still not ready to do at the federal level. So you often see this seesaw action between states and locales and the federal government. And if only we could just be on the same spectrum towards the same goals, right? We're saying that orally, people are saying they want a racial reckoning. You know, put your money where your mouth is. You know, we know when I think about the work of the Maryland Commission in particular, I think about all of the, you know, identification we have done around victims in this country, but also how racial violence was always pretty well photographed. So, you know, there's never been concerted efforts to identify the people in the lynch mobs. There's never been, you know, the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the most documented massacres. People were selling postcards after the massacre to show what happened, what they did. You may not know that charred Black body in the middle of the road. You may not be able to identify him, but you can identify the 3 men with assault rifles standing, 3 white men standing above him. So those efforts of truth telling, I think, also need to incorporate the perpetrators, which also most likely accountability needing and prosecution needing to come from actual institutions, like in the case of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, that actually sanctioned the violence. So those are my just lingering thoughts as we advance around truth in this country. In terms of getting involved, there's so many ways to do that. You know, Human Rights Watch has joined with the legacy Black organizations, reparations organizations, other organizations focusing on racial justice, because so many organizations are touching on racial justice issues, but had not made the connection between, you know, truth telling and repair, and needing to be engaged in that work. And so we launched a Why We Can't Wait campaign with over 360 organizations. We invite, you know, all organizations who want to commit to this work to join our coalition, grassroots, diverse, you know, local to national to international groups involved in this work. These are live legislative priorities and bills. So, you know, call your legislators, call House leadership, pass HR 40. We need a HR 40 House floor vote. We were supposed to get that before August recess, and here we are. They're now saying September. You know, call your legislators to support HCON Res 19, the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. There are things we need to do now that impact generations to come. And if we stall on this particular moment, then unfortunately, we're going to spiral into this consistent self-destruction, which does not aid the future and the livelihood of generations to come.
Thank you, Dreisen. Dr. Joshi, any final thoughts or ideas on ways that the ACS membership could engage in this?
I mean, I'm sure people in the audience know ACS is a counterpoint to another organization that is fueling a lot of the attacks on voting rights, on critical race theory. And if there are ways lawyers and non-lawyers can become involved in organizations like ACS, I'm also a Human Rights Watch alum. And these are the organizations, as well as local grassroots organizations, that we need to be supporting. I completely echo Dreisen's sense of urgency. One of my favorite sayings is by Fannie Lou Hamer, when she was asked about, why racial justice now? And she said, I'm not going to wait another 100 years for something that I was owed 300 years ago, because I will never know what it feels like, and I don't want that. And this is the moment, this is the political window that may not remain open. And I really want to echo the sense of urgency that the time is now.
Excellent, thank you. Zanita, same question for you.
Sure, yes, definitely the time is now. And, what I'm taking away from this conversation is just a reminder how important the work that Maryland is doing, is both in terms of, creating an example for other work within our state, important work that we need to do within our state, but also serving as a model for other states and perhaps even a national commission. And so, and also recognizing that while we may be the first in the United States to take on this particular effort, we're not the first in the world. And so just to take back some of the other TRCs that Dr. Joshi referenced, the work in Canada and Brazil and Philippines and others, just to make sure that we are implementing and taking the lessons of those experiences, both in what worked and what didn't work, and how we can improve and build upon what others have done in facing down, atrocities of the past and trying to move towards greater racial healing. And so, and in terms of what, those who are listening can do, we're obviously still early on in our pathway here in Maryland, but what we do already have is a successful legislative strategy in place. And so I certainly encourage those in other states and jurisdictions who would like to see their communities embark upon a similar effort. Let me know, reach out to me. I'm sure Zanella is going to have our contact information. I can make sure you have, the access to the legislative file. It's all public information, and you can see how we were able to secure bipartisan support of this bill in Maryland. Also, inspired by this movement, I think a lot of us have been, and even those of us who've been working in civil rights for some time, just in addition to sort of looking out what can we do sort of internally in our own spaces? And one thing that we are in the process of finalizing in the Maryland Attorney General's office is a document that provides guidance to all of our attorneys, whether they litigate or provide client advice, or whether they represent the Department of Transportation, Department of Environment, an acknowledgement of sort of the broad impact of systemic racism and other inequities, and how even in your day-to-day legal work, you can be a part of dismantling that racism. And so just to bring it at the forefront of everything that we do, because if we limit this work to the small unit of the Civil Rights Office, our newly, unit of 2 attorneys and up, we really can't have the impact that we need to have to make progress. And so I certainly encourage and challenge each of you to think about the work that you do, regardless of the area that you work in, and think about the ways that you can either challenge a client or challenge yourself to think about the disproportionate impact of a certain policy, act, argument, and how you might be able to rethink that and be a part, join this movement and actually actively combat racism and other inequities that you see in the world.
Well, my thanks and ACS's thanks to Dreisen, Dr. Joshi, Zanita, for such a fantastic conversation. As Russ and I mentioned at the very beginning, ACS is undertaking this effort, working with a number of organizations for years, and we support it. We're asking our chapters to to work on this, so please be in touch with your local chapters or ACS at info@acslaw.org on other ways to engage on this very important issue. And thank you so much, Lindsay Langho, my colleague who organized this fantastic panel, all our panelists, and for joining us today. Thanks, everybody.